Konnichiwa. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the armor in the game Ghost of Tsushima for PlayStation 4 and 5, as well as the upcoming Iki Island expansion, so stay tuned. Okay, so I want to cover a couple quick things about Ghost of Tsushima if you haven't heard of it already. It is a samurai-themed game that is reasonably historical for PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. It's based on the Mongol invasion, and it stars a character named Jin Sakai, who historically did not exist. The Sakai clan doesn't exist in Japanese history, but they come around the 14th century, and the game is set earlier in the 13th century. Now, the person that you're going against in this game that's leading the Mongol invasion is Khotun Khan, supposedly the grandson of Genghis Khan. However, this is also a fictional person. You know, there might have been a Khotun Khan in history, because let's face it, Genghis Khan had a lot of kids. Like, if he had an SUV, you couldn't fit enough stickers on the back window for all the kids that he had. So there might be one like that with that name in history, but anyways, as far as the game is concerned, it does not follow an actual historical figure called Khotun Khan. Now, Tsushima is a real island. The Mongols did invade. They invaded in 1274, which is when the game is set. Some of the locations, such as Castle Kaneda, are also real locations on the island of Tsushima, although all the events surrounding it in this game are, of course, fictitious, but it's nice to know that some of these locations are actually real. Now, the island of Tsushima is a real place, and in Ghost of Tsushima, the game, you do see a number of shrines that aren't actual real-life shrines. However, a real-life shrine in the real island of Tsushima was damaged, and there was a crowdfunding Kickstarter type thing created to try to get a bunch of funding to repair it. They met and exceeded their goal. They raised over $260,000 for it, and this was actually called out specifically by the guy in charge of the shrine repairs, who thanked the people who were fans of the game as well as the two creative directors for the game. So that was really cool, you know, people banding together and making sure that the shrine got repaired. So it's helped bring a lot of recognition to the island of Tsushima. Now, a few things that they do get right that I'm going to call out from the trailer, which I'm going to link below, is you'll notice that they, and I'm going to pause here so that you can watch it. If you haven't watched it, hit pause. Cool, did you watch it? All right, so we're back. So in the opening sequence that you saw for that, you'll notice that before they began the charge, they shot one arrow, followed by a lot of arrows. That was actually common back then. They actually had a specific signal type arrow. This is something you also see in The Last Samurai. Not that that's a historical documentary, but just something that reinforces this is the thing that they did. Here's a signal arrow, and then everybody lets loose. It could be signal, signal arrow could simply be, hey, troops are incoming, to alert the rest of your own forces that, if you need to move or flank or take any other action. But anyway, that was a historical thing. You see it sometimes today in cleansing type ceremonies. I'm not completely sure how they all work, but they do have what's essentially called a whistling arrow that they will shoot to purify things. So it's very ceremonial and a pretty cool thing. I'd like to actually see one day. Now, you also saw where Shimura sent Adachi down to break the spirits of the Mongols. He went down, he announced his name, said, "Send out your strongest warrior." This was a historical contributing factor towards the samurai losing so badly against the Mongols. The samurai were still ritualized, they were announcing their names because, of course, in taking heads, there was just more notoriety in taking the head of a famous general or someone with a longer lineage. And the Mongols didn't care. They were attacking in groups, they were attacking as, mounted from horseback. The samurai were dismounting to attack. Of course, they certainly had their mounted archery, but they were accustomed to doing foot combat to some extent, not completely, and this is why the Oyoroi, larger, bulkier armor that was popular as mounted archery, faded out and eventually became the Tosei Gosuku, or the style armor with just a more movable do that was designed more for foot combat rather than mounted combat. So that was a nice little inclusion to see that as a contributing factor at the very beginning of the game towards why the samurais were getting their butt handed to them. So there are a few creative liberties taken with the game, and this was announced up front by the creative directors. They said you're going to see samurai armor with matching sleeves, because at that time when they were primarily mounted archers, they would have had armor on one sleeve, and they said this would look strange to a lot of people, so they went with the matching armor concept, which is perfectly reasonable, and also the same reason that they went with the katana instead of the tachi, even though the tachi would be the more prevalent weapon at the time. And the Mongol invasion is one of the things that helped spur on the development of the katana and further refining from tachi into katana, but the katana is simply the cliche, well-known weapon of the samurai. So the creative team decided, let's go with that because it gets people that are familiar with samurai and these sort of commonalities interested in the game. You also see haikus appear in the game. However, they came around the 16th-ish century. I don't remember. It might be 15th, 17th. But anyway, they were not a thing back in the 13th century. So that's also a, samurai writing poetry and everything, which is a lot more of an Edo period thing. But they included it in the game because people are simply familiar with it. There's also a lot of tie-ins to Akira Kurosawa and a lot of his samurai films. I mean, the game even goes so far as to having an actual Kurosawa mode that you can use, doing it in black and white and amping up the weather effects and all. So it's not meant to be a historical documentary. It's meant to be a game based on these historical things. And I'm going to keep that in mind as I evaluate the armor for this. But, as a general rule, the armor is really good and it's really historical looking for a lot of it. So I'm actually quite pleased with it, and that's why I wanted to go ahead and do a video of it. It's been a few days shy of 1 year since Ghost of Tsushima was released. It was released July 17th, 2020. And I'll mention again at the end of the video that the Iki Island expansion is coming August 20th with the director's cut of the game if you haven't purchased it or pre-ordered it yet. I myself have only played the base game, finished all the way through to New Game Plus and gone through some of that, but I'm looking forward to doing the Iki Island expansion, and I might just do some of it and film it playing the game while wearing the armor because, hey, why not? Armor's cool, and I like the game too. So without further ado, let's get into the reviews of the armor.
Alright, for the first armor, let's take a look at the broken armor. It's still got one Osode left. It's a normal Nimai Do with a lot of lacing on it. The Haidate are there, but they're pretty much just fabric, and it's got a splint-style Sunyate. This looks like normal armor that you might see back then. He seems to have a proper type of undergarments on, and the armor itself is about right. It's missing all the skirting on the Kusazuri except for the front panel, so a normal armor would have had the rest, but given that he's missing an Osode as well, it's possible that maybe that was just damaged. This is the only incarnation we see of this armor, so that's the only thing to review for this one. So we're going to move on to the Samurai Clan armor. Now looking at the Samurai armor, this is my second favorite armor that you get in the game. It bears a lot of similarities in its first incarnation here to the broken armor. There's a Kusazuri with a single skirt, there's a Haidate, and a Nimai style Do. In this case, there is actually armor on the Haidate, and there is also splint Sunyate, which is proper and historically correct. One of the things I really like is that they included a lot of the small details, such as the cording that ties the helmet down. And this is a proper style of helmet as well. It's got a very nice shikoro to it. It's got the Fuki Gaishi, I believe is how you pronounce it, the ear flaps that are turned up. It's got a nice mempo, so it's a very nice armor even at the beginning, but it gets better. For the second evolution of the Samurai armor, now we can see that we also have the right number of Kusazuri skirts here. There's additional arm armor like you would see historically on an Oyori, and I'm going to include an image of that here on the side. And it also adds the Osode. The helmet is unchanged, the Haidate are unchanged, and the Sunyate are unchanged. So this would be a proper type of upgrade that you may have seen. And for the third and final evolution of the Samurai armor, there's a few small changes. There's a new Maidate, which is reminiscent of Date Masamune with the crescent moon. There's additional cord around the waist and on the Osode, which makes it a little bit more decorative. And they've even included a cool little detail, which is the, I don't quite know how to pronounce this, but Kyubi and Sendan no Ita, which are the protectors for the armpits on the left and the right side, which is also found on historical armor, and it's a really cool touch to see included with it. For Tadayori's armor, you'll notice that there's basically protection for the one sleeve. This is an archer's armor, so that's nice to see the asymmetricalness here with having a single sleeve. You'll also note the Suramaki, which is hanging from his belt. That's a historical item that was used by the samurai to keep spare bowstrings. So again, a nice little nod to having an archer type setup for this with an archer's armor. And we'll take a look once you've upgraded it. It also gains a body armor, but there is no additional arm armor, there's no additional leg armor, so they still keep with what an archer may have worn, particularly a lower ranking archer, because of course a higher ranking samurai that did archery would have a full set of samurai armor. It was based around being able to support archery. Even when they moved to the later style with the separate sleeves, you could pull one sleeve off to still do archery if needed. So Gosaku's armor is hands down my favorite in the game. It's got a lot of historical elements to it. You can see the Osode, the Jinbori. It's got an Oyuroi style do, which we can see has the proper 4 kusazuri panels to it, which are split in half again at the bottom. You'll note in this incarnation it does not have Haidate, which was actually a later invention for samurai armor, and something apparently that they didn't seem to like to wear a lot because it got in the way sometimes. But it being missing here would be correct for a lot of the Oyuroi that I've actually seen not having Haidate. And in the second evolution, you'll notice that it does gain the Haidate. It also gains Kogake, which are solid protection for the feet. And it also gets a little bit of fancier cording, and for some reason the style of the Jinbori changes. But in its third form, the Jinbori also changes again a little bit. We get Splint Sunyate added, and also a Nodawa, which is the additional protection underneath of the throat, which would be supplemental for the Mempo and the Tare, which is the hanging plate underneath. All of this is historically accurate for samurai armor, and it's pretty cool, so I'm very impressed with what they did with it. Now, the Sakai clan armor was popular with a lot of people, although it's not something that I wore more than once or twice just to take a look at it as I upgraded it. In its first incarnation here, you can see a standard do, which has the Sakai clan logo on it. And for the skirt, it is a scale skirt, which seems a little bit strange. It's not the type of kusazuri we're used to seeing, but that did actually exist historically. I'm going to put a little image of it in here. It's called Gyorin Kozani, and I may be pronouncing that wrong, as I most likely am, but that actually is historically accurate. Now, the scales would be a little bit smaller, so this is probably a little bit of an embellishment so that it appears better in the game and so that it's large enough so that you can see some level of detail on it, but that type of scale armor actually did exist. Now, the helmet, it looks a little bit like somebody just chopped the top half off of a Roman helmet that has the little cheek flaps to it, but this is actual historical Japanese armor as well, and it's called a hapuri. Now, in the second iteration of the Sakai clan armor here, you can see that the helmet actually has a male aventail out of kusari, and that is historically accurate, although it's fairly uncommon. It seems to be a lot more popular, especially in the late Edo period. The do has gone from the earlier common style that we see to actually being the Gyorin style scales now. I didn't particularly care for this type of change. I wish they would have kept the original one, but it is what it is. I think this is historically accurate on the do. I have seen it through the kusazuri for the skirting, but not for the do itself. So I'm unsure on this one, but it seems plausible. Now, as far as the Haidate, those look plenty historical. They have the normal smaller plates interspersed with the Kusari mail. And the Sode are scale as well, which I can't find the picture of, but I know I've seen before. I may not have it in digital format. It might have been in one of my books, but I have seen the scale Sode like that, so those are also accurate as well. Now, this third iteration of the Sakai armor I kind of thought was a little bit of a mess. The kusazuri has changed from scale type over to being what looks to be a tatami style, which is folding armor, not the mat that you cut with a sword, but tatami being a type of armor that's meant to break down and fold easily for storage and transporting. For some reason, the Haidate have become scale now as well. The arms are covered in scale. It sort of looks like a weird little fish man to me, so I don't know that this sort of appearance is historically accurate. It's a combination of stuff that might be plausible in and of itself, but seeing it together like this, I've certainly never seen a historical armor that looks like this. One nice nod on the helmet is the horns look a lot like Honda Tadakatsu, so that's cool, but it's, at least to me, not enough to actually redeem the armor itself. So this was probably the most fantasy-based armor in the game outside of the Ghost armor, and I'm going to cover that one next. Now, the Ghost armor is, of course, the pivotal armor in the game, since it's named Ghost of Tsushima. It's something that I can't imagine would have been used historically, perhaps maybe for some shinobi operations or something like that. ninja are not what a lot of people commonly think they were. However, if you wanted a lightly armored stealth type setup, this could be plausible for that. We can see that it has very basic haidate, very basic kote, and some kayahan on the legs, which are the padding on your shins there. So this could plausibly exist as an armor. He's carrying a bow. That, is something that I'd unlocked at that point, so it's not always there, but this is a setup that could be archery friendly as well. Now in this second iteration of the Ghost Armor, there's now a solid dough with kusazuri, which certainly would impact your ability to be stealthy in any way. There are splint sunyate, which wouldn't really be making any noise because they float on their own and move very silently. And there are better kote, which have some metal plates on the top as well, which could make a little bit of a noise, but they are relatively silent. The kusazuri would certainly be the most noisy aspect of this. Is it plausible for stealth? Kind of, but the whole game is based around a fantasy element, but the items in the armor itself here are at least historically reasonable. Even though the context of the game is not, the armor itself is pretty historically reasonable. Now for the third iteration of the Ghost Armor, basically just adds an extra cloak on top, a little bit of fabric there, and the sunyate get a solid kneecap to it. I'm not quite sure why. That's certainly not something you'd want if you were trying to run around and be kneeling on anything. I have both types of these sunyate, and I by far prefer the ones with the kiko or the hexagonal metal plates in the knees. Those are simply much more comfortable to be kneeling on and doing anything like that. If you're walking around, the solid style is fine. If you're on a horse, the solid style is fine, but that's not what this armor is used for in the game. It's a small fact, but, it's still there. So, overall, I like the Ghost Armor, but, as historically plausible, it's kind of a mishmash, but it is what it is. Now, Mongol armor is not something that I really know much about. I did find a reproduction of it from a group on Facebook called Mongolia Live that has a reproduction of a historical armor. It has some very similar elements. The helmet looks similar, the shoulders look similar. The body is a lamellar style, even though it's a little bit different than what we see in the game, and the one in the game has a lot more ornamentation with the furs and such. I think this would be historically plausible, even though it is pretty fancy looking here from Ghost of Tsushima. This is armor that, and spoiler warning if you haven't played the game and intend to, hop back in 10 seconds. But this armor is intended for Khotan Khan, who is your primary opponent in the game, and you're actually able to intercept and catch it. So this was for a very high Mongol leader, which is why it's so fancy, and why I think this might have been plausible.
So historically, Tsushima was invaded on November 5th by the Mongols, and Iki Island was also invaded on November 13th by the Mongols. Curious to see how this is going to be in the expansion itself. I myself just have a PlayStation 4, so I can't comment on the PlayStation 5 or any of the improved graphics or anything like that. The game is amazing on PlayStation 4. I am perfectly happy with it as is. The PlayStation 5 has haptic feedback and a few other things, but I'm not really trying to do like a game level review, so if you're interested in that, hit up YouTube or Google or whatever and find a few other videos that mention the PlayStation 5 stuff, because I don't have one, so I'm not really vested in figuring out all the info on that. That concludes my evaluation on the armor in the game Ghost of Tsushima. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and make sure you hit the bell so that it gives you notifications. And until the next video, sayonara.